Welcome to episode 31 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero network. 156 years ago, the Sand Creek Massacre took place in the southeastern part of so-called Colorado Territory. The massacre was carried out on November 29, 1864, led by Colonel Shivington. Around 700 members of the Colorado Cavalry attacked the Cheyenne and Arapaho, leaving over 200 dead, mostly women and children. Following the massacre, soldiers paraded through Denver with scalps. Some were sent east. The Denver theater even used them in plays. Colorado's foundation, like that of the U.S. itself, was built on white supremacist colonial violence, a violence that expressed itself through policing, politics, and policy. This month, I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Ari Kelman. He is the Chancellor's Leadership Professor of History at the University of California, Davis. He teaches on the Civil War and Reconstruction, the politics of memory, environmental history, Native American history, and America in the 1960s. He's the author of many books, including Battle Lines, A Graphic History of the Civil War, A Misplaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek, and A River and Its City, The Nature of Landscape in New Orleans. In this interview, Ari spoke about settler colonialism, the Civil War, the Dakota 38, the Sand Creek Massacre, decolonizing methodology, the politics of memory, and bleeding Kansas. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and here's a brief jingle by a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
Hello, and welcome to We Will Remember Freedom, a monthly podcast of anarchist fiction. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to the jingle for both of my podcasts. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcasts wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero network.
First off, how's your day going today?
It's actually been a nice day. Nice fall weather here, and got a bunch of stuff done and feeling pretty good.
So my first question is about your past. I know you're a fan of the punk band X, and maybe this relates, but I was wondering if you could describe a pivotal point where you started to reflect on power systems and propaganda systems that were taught in U.S. society, and when you started challenging these narratives that led you down your path in scholarship.
Wow, that's a great question. So it goes pretty far back for me, to be honest with you. My grandparents and my mom all survived the Holocaust in Warsaw, Poland. And so I grew up in a multilingual family that was very, very attuned to questions of power, and also particularly attuned to the way in which propaganda could be used in some pretty horrific ways. So to give you some concrete examples, I was really, some of my earliest memories are of my grandparents and my great uncle and great aunt sitting around after a dinner table and beginning to swap stories about World War II and about what had happened to the family. And I was just a fly on the wall, right? I was like a little kid, and I don't know, I never really got a chance to ask any of them whether they wanted me there and they were engaging in those conversations because they knew that I was there and they thought that it was important for me to hear about it, or if they were just sort of ignoring the fact that I was there. Either way, it was a fairly early exposure to the way in which government can mistreat citizens, to the way in which the powerful can exploit or even in some instances murder those with less power, and the way in which propaganda can function. I think probably there was a moment in which the intensely personal nature of all of this crystallized for me. So I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and again, my mom also was a Holocaust survivor, but it it was my relationship to that history, despite the fact that I was present for so many of these conversations, and they did have an impact on me. There's no question, but it wasn't immediately personal until I was I think I was in either 8th or 9th grade, and I asked my grandmother if she had any pictures from her wedding. And my grandmother was a very, very, she was a very loving woman. I was very close with her. So I don't want to characterize her as having like a hard edge or anything like that, but she was not someone who was intensely emotional. And I asked her that question, and she began sobbing. And she explained that, of course, and it was very insensitive of me. I just wasn't thinking. But she explained to me that, of course, they'd had to leave all of that behind, all of the family mementos, all of the repositories of memory, all of the kinds of things that for example, my family, we have a huge trunk that's filled with old photographs from when my kids were little, photographs of my parents. I mean, now everything's digitized. It's all in the cloud, right? But for most of my life, it wasn't. And we have all kinds of keepsakes like that. And my wife has the same from her family. And my grandmother just had none of that. And the absence of that material culture, the absence of those kinds of reminders of a past, even a really difficult or grim or horrific past, was, as I say, it was intensely personal for me. And then I kind of stayed, I attribute my upbringing, or I attribute my love of history to my upbringing, I should say. But I had really, really wonderful, I had an AP U.S. history high school teacher named Mrs. Stout, Audrey Stout. She's actually from Wisconsin. She'd gone to the University of Wisconsin. She'd been involved in the anti-war movement. She was a really, really fascinating person, and she was remarkable. And she was someone who was very keen on teaching history through the eyes of non-elites. She was extremely interested in making sure that we understood the nation's history of oppression, its history of racial violence, its history of mistreatment of indigenous and people of African descent. And it had a really big impact on me. And then I ended up going to the University of Wisconsin as an undergraduate, not entirely because of Mrs. Stout, but it certainly helped. And at Wisconsin, I had a lot of mentors who continued to teach from that perspective.
Nice. So it's kind of like your family and the history and the stories kind of planted these seeds, and then they were watered by learning these, bottom-up type histories, or histories from, like you said, not from the elite.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really beautiful metaphor to think about it. And again, I've always wondered if my grandparents intentionally scattered those seeds, right? I mean, it's very, very easy to imagine that they might have wanted to, but I never got to ask them. They both died long enough ago that I didn't get an opportunity to speak with them about that. I've asked my mom, and my mom isn't sure. She thinks that it was important for them that I understood that our family had experienced that kind of oppression, and obviously the overwhelming majority of my family was killed during the war. My grandparents, my great aunt and great uncle made this pact that they would either live or die together as a foursome. And then my grandparents, my grandmother had my mom, and so there was a fifth. But most of their siblings and their cousins and their parents and aunts and uncles were all killed. And so I think it was really important to them. But again, I just don't know whether or not, as I say, I love the metaphor that you used. I don't know whether or not they scattered those seeds. But I think you're absolutely right that those seeds were watered and they were fertilized by really, really wonderful teachers along the way. And I mean, it's very, very funny. Mrs. Stout died many years ago now, but she knew that I became a history professor, and she was not surprised by that. But I've come across some of my other I was a terrible high school student. I mean, just absolutely wretched. Like I barely graduated from high school, and because I was way too busy listening to X and other punk rock. And I'm not joking around. I mean, I had totally different priorities. And I mean, I think my priorities brought me to punk rock. And then punk rock accentuated those priorities, right? It's hard to know exactly where that cycle begins and ends. But certainly I've met some of my other high school teachers when I go back and visit my mom, and there's been a couple of instances where they just look stricken, right? They'll say to me, "Oh, what are you up to?" And I think they're expecting the answer to be, "Well, I got out of prison like 6 months ago, and I'm on a work release program, and I'm trying to see if I can keep my life together." And instead I'm like, "Well, I'm a tenured history professor out in California," and they're like, "What happened to you?" So I don't think it was ever entirely clear to people that I was going to end up doing this, but it's easy enough in retrospect to understand sort of again how these seeds got planted and who was responsible for nurturing them along the way.
I love those stories. Thanks for sharing those.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
My next question, kind of want to look at an overview of the Civil War and then dig into Sand Creek Massacre more.
Sure.
So this question, I was wondering if you could speak about how colonialism ties into the Civil War and white supremacy as a whole.
Sure.
And I've heard you describe the Civil War as a war for liberation and also a war of empire. For example, William T. Sherman, he used scorched earth tactics on the South. Then this became the precedent for tactics used against the indigenous in the West. And Chivington fought for the Union, and John Evans did as well, but they were very racist. They didn't believe that Native Americans had souls. There seems to be a misunderstanding of this binary between the North and the South, that one was against white supremacy and one wasn't. Kind of like when Malcolm X says, if you're in Canada, that's the South. Like anything south of Canada is the South. And
yeah,
I really feel this gets to the foundation of the U.S., of slavery and colonialism, capitalism and genocide. I was wondering if you could kind of speak about this dichotomy that's misunderstood.
I'm happy to, and I'm gonna do it from a few different perspectives. So I think a good place to start, and where I often try and ask people to think about this issue, is the 1860 election. So in the 1860 election, the Republican Party, which is a party that emerges out of the Free Soil Party, the Republican Party runs Abraham Lincoln, and the Democratic Party splits. It splits over the issue of slavery and the question of how pro-slavery it's going to be. And generally speaking, the way that the 1860 election is understood in American culture and in American memory, and the way that it's taught in schools and the way that it's depicted in scholarly literature and also in popular culture, is that was an election that was a referendum on the future of slavery. And so you've got a Republican Party that is saying, and Lincoln is saying explicitly, we're going to make sure that slavery doesn't spread into new territory in the West, territory that the United States conquered during its war with Mexico about a decade and a little bit earlier. And meanwhile, the Democratic Party is saying either we're going to allow the people in these Western territories to determine for themselves whether they're going to have slavery, or if you're looking at another part of the Democratic Party, which again split during the 1860 election, we're going to make sure that the federal government will never regulate slavery under any circumstances. And so it's easy enough to look at that election and say, oh, this is an election between an anti-slavery party, which is the Republican Party, and a party that's more conflicted about slavery, but really is a white supremacist and pro-slavery party, the Democratic Party. And there's some truth to that. The problem is that it ignores some fairly fundamental issues. And that's that the 1860 election was also a kind of referendum on the question of what the United States government, the federal government, was going to do with the West. And that question involved not only the issue of whether slavery would be allowed to spread into the West, but it also involved the question of how the United States was going to help settle the West and what would happen to the people, many of whom were indigenous, who were already living in what we then, what we now call the West, what we then would have called the West, but let's say the area around and beyond the Mississippi River, just to sort of be clear about precisely what we mean. And the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they disagreed on the precise mechanisms of how the West should be settled, but they were totally in lockstep on the question that the United States should be an empire and that it should subjugate indigenous peoples. And remember that Abraham Lincoln was okay with slavery existing where it already did in the South. And so to describe the Republican Party as a party that opposed white supremacy is already a big mistake. But then if you add in this new geographic orientation of the Trans-Mississippi West, all of a sudden you have two parties that really agree that settler colonialism should be the mechanism for conquering and then settling the area around and beyond the Mississippi. And so during the war, the Confederacy tries to make some inroads with Native peoples, probably most famously forging an agreement with the Cherokee Nation. But the Cherokee Nation splits over the question of whether or not it should ally with the Confederacy, and the Confederacy doesn't worry about the bloodshed that's happening within the Cherokee Nation. And meanwhile, the Union is engaged in all of these horribly bloody episodes, including Sand Creek, including the Dakota War in Minnesota, and many others. And so what we see coming out of the Civil War is that the Union and the Republican Party win the war. This is the party of Abraham Lincoln, and as a consequence, slavery is abolished in the United States, but at the same time, the United States uses many of the same mechanisms of oppression, including white supremacy and including reproducing what to that point had been largely a northern wage labor capitalist economy, and simply moving those structures into the West to try and conquer new terrain and to try and conquer new peoples. And so the Civil War becomes a kind of an opportunity for a settler colonial, hyper-capitalist vision of what the United States should become to take deep root in new soil, which is why in the aftermath of the Civil War, unsurprisingly, we end up with a few decades of warfare between Native peoples, particularly between a number of the Plains tribes, and federal soldiers. The Civil War becomes a kind of a catalyst or an accelerant in this explosion of racial violence in the American West.
Thank you for breaking that down so elegantly. I know that was a big question, and what you're talking about with the Dakota, it also ties in with the Dakota 38.
Yeah, exactly.
And Lincoln and the largest mass execution, which was all indigenous.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So during the Dakota War, the federal government dispatches soldiers and also officers to Minnesota on is it the day before or the day? I think it's the day after Christmas. I think it's December 26th, 1862. 38 Dakota men who had been ostensibly captured in the conflict, but a number of them had nothing to do with the conflict. There are a few instances where they simply share names with people who had been combatants, Dakotas who had been combatants, and there are just some other episodes where they just have the wrong people they're hanged in the town square in Mankato in as you say, the largest mass execution in U.S. history. And these sorts of it's a kind of from my perspective, there are a number of different ways to interpret that episode, which is almost unimaginably horrible. But I think one of the ways to interpret it is that the federal government is trying to use violence as a kind of a spectacle to uphold the structures of white supremacy, to try and make sure that tribal peoples, that Native peoples, Native nations understand that federal authority can be put to extraordinarily violent, brutal ends in order to prop up the power structures that were in place prior to the war and that the federal government wants to make sure are going to be in place after the Civil War is over. And so you end up seeing, again, this kind of a replication of white supremacy in a new geographic area. And so the way in which we understand the war as having been a war of liberation, and again, I don't want to suggest it wasn't. It is critically important that the institution of slavery is abolished as a consequence of the war during the era of Reconstruction, and I don't want to give that short shrift. It is critically important that the Republican Party does believe that slavery shouldn't be allowed to expand, shouldn't be allowed to root itself in fresh soil. These are very, very important things, but it doesn't mean that the Republican Party isn't a party of white supremacy, right? There's a way in which the Lincoln administration and Lincoln himself, who is a Westerner, there's a way in which they conceptualize the American West in the same way that, say, Thomas Jefferson did, that it should be a kind of an empire for liberty is the phrasing that Jefferson uses. But what Lincoln means by that, and what Jefferson means by that, is that it should be an empire for white men. When they're talking about liberty, they're talking about the freedom and the opportunity for white men to advance themselves economically. And the way in which that's often going to happen is through structures of oppression and white supremacy.
Yeah, real estate speculators, like with the Land Act and all this, and all the land they gave to white settlers. And
totally. So yeah, I mean the spring and summer of 1862. So again, I'm just going to flash back really quickly. Lincoln gets elected, right? And then almost immediately, Southern states, beginning with South Carolina, start seceding. And by the time Lincoln's inaugurated, most of the Confederacy has constituted itself into a new nation, and the Southern states have brought with them their congressional delegations from the United States Congress, right? The South has seceded, and they bring their representatives from Congress with them. And what that then does is it creates an incredible kind of an opportunity for the Republican Party, because all of a sudden most of the opposition is gone. They've left. And so they're going to be replaced by Republicans. And so the Republican Party then in the spring and summer of 1862 passes the Pacific Railroad Act, passes the Homestead Act, passes the Moral Land Grant Colleges Act, creates a Bureau of Agriculture. All of these things are going to be tools that will allow settlers, that will allow a settler colonial enterprise to be more successful in the West. And so when you talk legislatively and when you talk about the Civil War, those mechanisms are so critical because they create the context that allows the land speculators that you were mentioning a moment ago, real estate speculators and others who consolidate huge parcels of land and who then sell that off. These are kind of the, I don't know how to put it other than they're like the shock troops of empire, right? They're like the people who go out there into the field and they gobble up enormous quantities of land, no matter who may have been living on it previously or using it previously. And the Civil War also is critically important because it becomes a pretext for dispossession. So I mentioned earlier that the Cherokees had sided with the Confederacy despite a split in the Cherokee Nation, and that decision then becomes a justification for the federal government to dispossess the Cherokees from land that ostensibly they were given in what at that time was called Indian Territory. Today it's the state of Oklahoma, but the state of Oklahoma, as your listeners and as you probably know, contains huge amounts of land that belongs to Native nations. And so the Cherokees' decision to have fought with the Confederacy during the Civil War becomes a rationale or a justification that the federal government uses to take land from the Cherokees in the aftermath of the Civil War. And similar things happen in Minnesota, where the federal government and the state of Minnesota, again, significantly decreased the amount of land that's controlled by Native nations, including the Dakotas, because of the Dakota War, and also in Colorado, which was Colorado Territory at the time, because of the fighting on the road to and then from the Sand Creek Massacre. There are a number of instances, again, in which land that was supposed to belong to Native people in perpetuity, it was supposed to be theirs forever, ends up being taken from them so that settlers can move onto that land. Again, the Civil War is this critical, it's this critical catalyst of settler colonialism and American imperialism.
Thank you for describing that so efficiently. To put a footnote on the 13th Amendment in abolishing slavery, you say abolishing slavery except under punishment, so it's still ongoing in the incarceration system. And
absolutely, and the abolition of slavery is there have been a number of new books, including by Adam Rothman and by a bunch of other really, really talented historians, including by my colleague Greg Downs, all of which indicate that the abolition of slavery was not something that happened with the stroke of a pen, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, the fight against slavery was a fight that was often led by enslaved people themselves, particularly during the Civil War. It was often African-American soldiers and African-American people who would strike the most critical blows against slaveholders and against a system of slavery. And then, as you say, even after the 13th Amendment is ratified, we still have all kinds of systems of unfree labor in the United States. This only deals with part of a kind of systemic labor exploitation, and again, an effort to try and make sure often that people of color don't have the ability to move. They don't have the kind of mobility that we would associate with true freedom.
Yeah, and thanks for pointing that out, of the decades and centuries of slave revolts that led to it, and the Haitian Revolution and sabotaging and all of the, like Nat Turner's Rebellion and all those that led and built onto that.
Yep, exactly.
And then zooming in more on the Sand Creek Massacre and your work, wonderful work, A Misplaced Massacre. You did hundreds of interviews for this book. I was wondering, what did you find maybe most surprising about these interviews, or can you share some transformational experiences you had doing the interviews?
Sure. I mean, I think a good place to start with the interviews is just to understand that there's been an effort in recent years on the part of scholars, particularly scholars doing indigenous history, to try and decolonize their methods. And so in doing the work for this book, I was trying to do ethical scholarship that would be rooted in communities. And so it became clear to me that even though prior to writing this book, I didn't have a huge amount of experience with oral histories or ethnographies, the Native communities and particularly the Sand Creek descendants organizations with which I was going to be working, those organizations understood the collection of stories or oral histories as being the single most important way that they should be preserving history. And so I, working with them, decided that it would make sense for me, if I was going to, again, try and do any sort of decolonized history, even as a non-Native person coming into these communities, that if I wanted to be respectful of these communities, that I should do that kind of work as well. And then I looked at a number of different tribal protocols, particularly protocols that were used by Cheyenne memory keepers and used those protocols to guide the way in which I conducted the interviews and the way in which I would use those interviews in my own work. And the most important of those was that it's important never to paraphrase, that one always has to quote people faithfully and fully. And so the book, for people who have read it, and for those who have read it, I apologize for all of its many flaws, but for people who have read it, they'll know that it has a lot of quotations in it. It's very, very rich in relying on that source material. So turning to your question, I think probably the most interesting and maybe amusing way of answering the question is to say that a number of people have asked me why the Sand Creek Descendants groups chose to speak with me, why they were willing to sit down for these interviews. And I think the answer to that is that Laird Komatsiva, who was a Southern Cheyenne chief, made the decision that he was going to work with me because at the time he was working on an Article 6 reparations claim. This emerged out of a treaty, the Treaty of the Little Arkansas, in the aftermath of Sand Creek. And Laird hoped that I might be able to publicize the work that he was doing, and that there was this outstanding treaty claim that had not yet been extinguished in other negotiations between the federal government and the Cheyennes. Once Laird made the decision to work with me, the Northern Cheyennes agreed to talk with me, but they they were very clear that they wanted to spend a fair amount of time with me before they would actually sit down for interviews. So I went up to Lame Deer. I drove from Denver to Lame Deer probably 4 times before they would even vote on whether they were going to work with me. And the first time I went up, I built straw bale houses with them. The second time, I helped put together lodges for the 4th of July powwow. The third time I went up, I helped prepare and then clean up the the Labor Day powwow. And then the fourth time I went up just to visit with a bunch of folks. And then they voted on whether they would speak with me. And so getting to the heart of your question, the experience of actually spending a fair amount of time with people, meeting their families, eating with them, laboring with them, building houses, getting the powwow grounds ready, and then cleaned up. In some instances, drumming with them. In one very embarrassing instance, dancing with them. I'm just the worst dancer of all time. But those experiences of actually spending time with people before we turned to work were, I think, more transformative and maybe not more surprising, but I think were more revealing and powerful than much of what I learned in the interviews. So then when we sat down for the interviews themselves, I knew these people. I wouldn't want to flatter myself and say that I was their friend, but I at least knew a little bit about them. They knew a little bit about me. And then I discovered a thing that interviewers, and I suspect that this is something that you've learned many, many times through the years doing the work you do, that interviewers learn over and over again, and that's that people like talking about themselves, and they like talking about their work, and it's intensely satisfying and maybe even flattering to be asked questions about one's work. And so people were surprisingly forthcoming and surprisingly willing to talk with me about the work that they had done when I was doing the research for this project. And I never really thought to myself, oh, they trust me or they like me, because it never occurred to me that was necessarily the case or that it was even necessarily important. I think it was more that they looked at this as an opportunity to talk about something that was very important to them and to hope that it might then be preserved. Certainly when I finally did speak with the Northern Cheyennes, when the Northern Cheyenne Sand Creek Descendants Committee finally met with me about whether or not they were going to work with me, Steve Brady, who is the head man of the Crazy Dog Society, he's no longer alive, unfortunately, a really, really wonderful guy. Steve, at that meeting, asked me flat out, he said, so if we work with you, what do we get out of this? And I said, gee, Steve, I don't know. I'll send you a bunch of copies of the book, but there's not much more I can do. And he said, that's exactly the right answer. He said, we get so sick of people who tell us that they're somehow going to change our lives or or make things better for us. He said we would much rather know up front that we'll get some copies of the book, and if we like it, that's great, and if not, and so, we kind of established at that point that I wasn't gonna bullshit them, at least, and so I think that was helpful.
Yeah, it's just a really genuine, just straight up answer to that. Yeah, I love that story. I was wondering if you could share some stories from your research about indigenous anti-colonial resistance. I know you wrote in A Misplaced Massacre, quote, Native warriors disrupted the mail, menaced stage lines, and drove off workers building railroads.
So in the 19th century, I think that I'm going to give you a slightly different answer. The reason I'm pausing is because I'm trying to think about how to answer this. And so I've just written an essay right now about the myth of the vanishing Indian. This was the 19th century idea that emerged out of racial science, the pseudoscience of the day, which suggests that because Native peoples were necessarily pre-modern and incapable of adaptation, and that when they were confronted with Euro-American civilization, they weren't simply going to be overawed, they were actually going to disappear. They were hardwired by racial inferiority to vanish, literally. And so I've just written this essay about the way in which that's nonsense, and I'm rooting it in, I don't know if you know Dee Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, very, very famous book, which is, yeah.
That was kind of like, I guess, the back part of my question of the term survivance that's used by one Native American poet of survival and resistance, and how that agency is brought in.
So that's exactly where I'm heading. So in the 19th century, getting back to the question that you asked earlier about the Civil War, there was this sense on the part of many Republicans, many federal lawmakers, whether in Congress, that when settlers went into the American West, Native peoples would disappear. And then they were totally shocked when that didn't happen, when it turned out that all of these Native nations that were in the West already were completely committed to struggling for their own survival, struggling to resist this incursion onto their land, struggling to protect their families, struggling to protect their sovereignty, whether it was political or cultural, struggling to protect their way of life, the ways in which they were different from settler communities. And that then exploded into what people, including Dee Brown and others, have sort of flattened by calling the Indian Wars, which weren't just one thing. They were a lot of different things that involved a lot of different Native nations. And so all of that was a form of, at least in my view, was a form of resistance to oppression and a form of resistance to settler colonialism. And so you see, for example, the Northern Cheyennes, just to give you, again, one example, in the aftermath of Sand Creek, they move onto the plains for a period of time. They move around. Eventually, they make their way into what today is Montana. But over a period of almost 2 decades, really a decade and a half, let's say, including horrible explosions of violence like at the Little Bighorn and elsewhere, the Northern Cheyennes are steadily engaged in warfare against the federal government of the United States. And finally, the U.S. federal government gets so tired of this fighting that it says to the Northern Cheyennes, holy crap, what do you guys want? And the Northern Cheyennes say, we want this land. We want this land that's on the Tongue River in today's southeastern Montana, and the federal government gives it to them. The Northern Cheyennes win. They get the land that they want, which is where they live now, with capital in Lame Deer, and it's some of the most beautiful land in the United States, and they're still there. They never disappear, right? It is a classic example of survivance, and I don't want to say that their lives are easy. They have an incredibly high rate of diabetes. They have high rates of joblessness. It's a very, very difficult place to live in a lot of ways, but they continue as an independent nation, right? They remain true to their own history and culture, and they've done that in the face of unbelievable onslaught. And that they've succeeded is this extraordinary testament to their desire to be who they are.
Thank you for sharing that. And adding on to that, that was one of my favorite parts of your book when you were describing the dedication ceremony, where Eugene Little Coyote, the Northern Cheyenne tribal president, he spoke about how the Sand Creek story scared him as a child and left him distrustful of whites. As you said, he mentioned that nearly 4 in 10 Northern Cheyenne were unemployed, lived in poverty, high rates of diabetes. I think something really powerful that he said was that the Northern Cheyenne could not treat sickness with memorials, could not feed their children on apologies, and could not find shelter within multicultural bromides. I was wondering if you could speak more about when you were there and listening to this, or if there was any other talks after this or more context to this.
So, I mean, I think overall, I want to be a little bit cautious about. Well, I'm just trying to think about things that I can share that people I know have told me I can share. I don't want to, again, going back to the tribal protocols that still govern the way that I use, or that I think about the appropriate use of the stories that people have shared with me. So I think the best example really is probably the way in which the spiritual healing run, which is a relay between the Sand Creek site, which is in southeastern Colorado, and Denver, which is roughly 100-ish miles away. This is a 2-day relay run that the Northern Cheyennes gather for every year around the anniversary of the massacre. And youth and in the tribe make this run, and it's supported by elders and others. And it is a way in which the Northern Cheyennes have been very, very clear that they are reclaiming land that used to be theirs, and they are announcing to the state of Colorado that despite what happened at the Sand Creek Massacre, they're still here, that they still exist, that any efforts at wiping out their people, any efforts at genocide were not successful, and that new generations will continue to do this and will continue to announce their presence on this land. And so they run, I mean, very, very pointedly, and in my view, it's an incredibly profound and emotional event every year. They run from the site of the massacre, which is perhaps the low point in the Northern Cheyenne Nation's history. They run from there to the state capitol in Denver, to the emblem of state power, the state power that was dispatched to Sand Creek to try and wipe out their people. And they do this, as I say, annually to demonstrate, to drive home the point that they are still around, and that they have survived, and that they have resisted, and that they remain a sovereign and independent nation that has its own laws, that governs itself, that takes care of its own people, that has its own language and its own culture. And I think that that's really the most profound way in which certainly I understood survivance to operate for the descendants.
Thank you for sharing that. That actually kind of ties into my next question on with the National Park Service, and they worked with descendants of the Sand Creek Massacre survivors. So on one hand, they worked with them on that, and you wrote very eloquently about this. And with the term being thrown around of decolonization and also land back, from speaking to the descendants, where do they see justice being for Sand Creek, and has there been talks for the state to actually give the land back?
So there was some talk briefly that the land might be conveyed to the Southern Cheyennes, but that raised a very, very complicated question of whether or not the Northern Cheyennes, the Northern Arapahoes, and the Southern Arapahoes would have a partial ownership stake, or whether or not they would have the right to use the land if they wished for ceremonial or other purposes. And then there was the question of how a Native nation that is located in present-day state of Oklahoma would be able to utilize land that is in southeastern Colorado, and what it would mean in terms of having to pay taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, the tribes, and in this case I'm talking about 4 tribes, decided that placing this land into federal trust as a unit of the National Park Service was going to better serve their core interest, which was to make sure that no one would ever forget that the Sand Creek Massacre had happened. And that by making this a unit of the national park system, they were going to have the greatest likelihood of preserving this land so that future generations would understand what had happened there.
Thank you for sharing that. Kind of zooming out now on the public history and memories. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of people don't have access to EBSCO and time to research, because they're just working a different job or different life, and the politics and memory with that. And I really see that public history is how the conversations are made, kind of like the news. If the news is always talking about the iPhone 12 or what this celebrity is doing, these are the conversations being held by the public, which creates a very detrimental conversation.
I was about to say, that's pretty depressing, but I think you're probably right.
Yeah, and a lot of these news shows are really just advertisements of stock footage given to teleprompters. But this is the value of public history, and you really did a good job of showing how the Statue of the Capitol from 1909 to the obelisk that was at Sand Creek and how the wording changed. And I was wondering if you could talk about public history and memorials, and then also about how history can be silenced by donors and the politics of that.
So, obviously we've been engaged now. Well, I would argue that this is a very, very long-standing feature of American culture, but certainly since the Charlottesville episode in Charlottesville, Virginia, relatively early in the Trump administration, we've had a renewed focus on questions of memorialization, and particularly on the meaning of memorial landscapes and what it means that we memorialize certain things and that we don't memorialize others. So why is it that the University of Virginia has on its campus statues to a number of Confederate generals and slaveholders, but very, very few? Well, and why is it known as Mr. Jefferson's University? He founded it. But is it necessary that we continue to think of it in those terms, or should we understand these landscapes as being more fluid than that? And my own perspective on this is that one of the ways in which we determine who we are as a nation is by struggling over the question of what we should memorialize and in what way. And that I view these conversations, even when they turn very heated, even in some instances when they become violent, as being absolutely necessary parts of determining who we are as a nation of nations. The United States isn't just a single nation, it's a nation that contains many nations, and that this is very, very, very complicated, and that these are very, very challenging negotiations, as we've seen in recent years. And so there's a way in which the memorialization of a horrific event like Sand Creek is understood by some onlookers as a signal that the relationship between tribal peoples and federal authority might somehow be improving. And perhaps there's some kernel of truth to that. But I think that it's probably better understood as a way in which Native peoples are, going back to your question about survivance and both survival and resistance, that Native peoples increasingly are saying that they need to be part of these national conversations about what should and shouldn't be remembered. So then the second question that you asked around donors is one that I think is particularly fraught and challenging for people who, like me, teach at universities. Universities are, of course, very, very much indebted to donors, and we increasingly look to private philanthropy for support, particularly at state universities, as states, for a variety of different reasons, are disinvesting. In California, at least where I teach, one of the most important reasons that the state is disinvesting in public higher education is because it's using that money to support a prison industrial complex instead. That it's simply taken money that used to be spent on education and is now spending it on incarceration. Nevertheless, we whatever the reason might be, because the state is disinvesting in that way, we in the University of California find ourselves increasingly beholden to what you might call not just individual donors, but a donor class. Very, very wealthy people who, again, let me be very clear, sometimes are quite generous and deeply philanthropic and choose to share their wealth with these kinds of public institutions. But when they share in that way, they are, in some cases, purchasing for themselves the right to be involved in decisions, including, for example, the naming of buildings, or whether or not there will be statues on a campus to certain kinds of people. And it just further complicates our ability to have these conversations in good faith when we know that we also have to keep third parties, again, donors who in almost every instance I'm very, very grateful to, but we have to keep those people happy as well. And this can become a way in which elites and a way in which wealthy people purchase the right to shape a historical narrative and to shape our understanding of the past. And so, excuse me, coughing during the COVID crisis is never a good idea. People look at you funny. But we have to be very, very cautious about that because we need to make sure that we can have these conversations in good faith.
Thank you for breaking that open. Since the murder of George Floyd, there's been an expanded backlash against colonial structures and statues. There's been direct action in Colorado where, I think it was in Portland, actually, a Lincoln statue was taken down on Indigenous Peoples Day this year.
Yep.
In Denver, they took the Kit Carson statue down because they
took the Civil War statue, the statue that I write about in Misplaced Massacre. They took that down on the state capitol steps.
Oh yeah, and that had been graffitied and everything too. And the Columbus statue was taken down by direct action by protesters.
Yep.
And when you were working on Battle Lines, didn't you have a possible alternate ending of two statues talking that you were reminiscing about doing?
So Battle Lines, for your listeners, is this. It's a graphic history of the Civil War that I wrote with a really wonderful illustrator named Jonathan Fettervorm. And I wanted the either the penultimate or the final chapter to be a Civil War statue and to have it come to life, or to at least have it speak. And Jonathan rightly thought that this was a hopelessly cheesy way of interrogating questions of memorialization. So we went with something which was much more subtle around the way in which Civil War memory is produced and reproduced, first by participants in the war and then by people looking back on it. But I regularly tease Jonathan and make fun of him and let him know that he does owe me a talking statue. So maybe in another book that we work on.
I do like the idea, though. I do. Going back to the beginning of the Civil War and then comparing where we're at right now in this pivotal space, some people have said that we've been in a Civil War, in a way, a slow-mo one. Not to romanticize the Civil War at all and the violence involved, but we've been in a Civil War since Charlottesville. I was wondering of the comparisons of Bleeding Kansas to that, and the shootings by the white supremacists in Kenosha, and just the very volatile situation we're in right now. I was wondering how you see that as a historian.
It's so I as a Civil War historian, I've fairly consistently resisted those kinds of analogies until the past few years. And I'm still very, very hopeful that those analogies are inapt, but I will say to you that I think that for the first time in a very, very long time, I do look around the United States and it does feel more closely akin to the 1850s than certainly I had ever hoped to live through. And I mean, I can just give you a few examples of what I mean by that. There's sort of an article of faith among Civil War historians that it comes out of a book by Jim McPherson called Battle Cry of Freedom. And I'm gonna butcher the quote, so please understand this is a paraphrase, not a quote. But McPherson basically writes something like, people speaking the same language, and he meant English, Americans speaking the same language could say the same words and mean entirely different things. And what he means by that is that on the road to the Civil War, it got to a point that Southerners and Northerners could experience the same event and they could talk about it in the same way, and they would understand it as having been entirely different. So the probably the most extreme example of this is John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, which was an event that for Southerners was viewed as an unsurprising but totally horrifying outgrowth of the excesses of abolitionism. That Southerners had been warning for many, many, many years that abolitionists were fomenting insurrection and violence against Southerners. And here was John Brown descending upon Harper's Ferry, trying to seize the weapons there, to use those weapons to share with enslaved people who would then, he believed, liberate themselves in a kind of a sea of blood. And Southerners looked at this and they were absolutely horrified, and they identified it not only with the most radical elements of Northern politics, but they identified it more broadly with Northerners. And meanwhile, Northerners looked at Harper's Ferry and they were sort of appalled in many instances by what had happened, but they understood it as yet another byproduct of Southern tyranny, of the way in which the so-called slaveocracy and its efforts to maintain a stranglehold on American politics, a stranglehold at any cost, would necessarily lead to this kind of violence. And I look around now, and I don't think we're necessarily quite there yet, but I mean, certainly I look at people like Cliven Bundy seizing federal land, the Mahler Wildlife Sanctuary, and I look at some people on the far conservative end of the American political spectrum who are very, very supportive of actions like that. Meanwhile, I look at people who tend to be more progressive or even just liberal, and who look at that and they see this as an example of lawlessness. I look at something like Charlottesville, where I think most people look at what happened in Charlottesville and they see that as an example of a looming threat of violent white supremacists who are coming to try and terrorize people, and then the president says there are good people on both sides. It's very, very hard to know how to reconcile my response to an event like that when the president of the United States views it so differently. You look at something like, as you say, I'm going to choose not to use the name of the murderer in Kenosha, but you look at that kind of an action, and I don't know if you've been paying attention, but in the past few days, there are elected officials, conservative Republicans, who are saying that someday he should be in the United States Congress. Well, I look at him as, yeah, exactly, and I look at him as a white supremacist, as a violent white supremacist, as a murderer, right? As someone who I mean, I have my own issues with whether incarceration is a reasonable form of punishment, but I mean, certainly this is someone who's committed an extraordinary crime, and to celebrate him for that I don't know what to make of that. I mean, I really don't. Not to mention that right now, as we're doing this taping, we're of course in an incredibly strange and upsetting moment of the United States history, where we have a president-elect who clearly won the election, and that's Joe Biden, who I'll be very candid with you and say I'm not a huge fan of President-elect Biden's, but he won fairly. And meanwhile, we have President Trump in office casting doubt on that election and suggesting that people who are his allies and his followers should disrupt the electoral process. Well, again, as an observer of American history, as a Civil War historian, it scares the hell out of me. I mean, I don't know what else to say. Mm-hmm. I don't know how we reconcile ourselves and how we find a way to compromise when we have incommensurable understandings of the same events. Right? It's okay to disagree about whether or not you think there should be Medicare for all. It's okay to disagree about whether or not you believe that federal subsidies or the forgiveness of federal student loans is good policy or bad policy. It's a very, very different thing to say that the votes of some hundreds of thousands of Georgians or of Michiganders or of Pennsylvanians should be thrown out so that President Trump can stay in office. I don't know where the compromise is on that sort of a disagreement, right? I mean, I just don't, and so I'm more worried than I have been in a very long time, and I hope I'm wrong to be worried, and I hope that the next few years will prove that I was just being short-sighted and anxious over nothing.
Yeah, no, it is definitely unprecedented, and kind of weaving through the different points that you made, I still see this underlying, we may differ on Medicare for all, but when we're looking at the extraction industry and the ongoing colonial project, you had, Obama and Biden who passed the DAPL pipeline, the Keystone, and the people who are still resisting this, and then Trump who came through and put them all back online again.
Yep.
See those as still the common ground for the American empire.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Anyway, this got depressing, man.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be depressing. Well, I want to end on a good note of I had one question actually. Did you say that Silas Soule had met with John Brown before? It's hard to find a lot of info on. So. Yeah,
so there's stories that indicate that Soule. So I don't know whether it's pronounced Soule or Soule, and you have to forgive me. I've always pronounced it Soule, but I know a bunch of people who pronounce it Soule, and I who am I? I just don't know. But there are stories that indicate that Soule's family in Kansas were allies of John Brown's. Whether Silas himself ever met John Brown, I don't know. But there's enough local history and family history to indicate that certainly the Soule family and John Brown were alive.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. And to end, just wanted to know where people could find your work, and also if some of the new work you're working on. I didn't know if you were working on a graphic history of the Battle of Little Bighorn, and then I had also read that you were possibly working on a new book about the Civil War and the so-called Indian Wars.
Yeah, I'm writing a big book right now, which is called For Liberty and Empire: How the Civil War Bled into the Indian Wars. And I'm writing that book for a press called Basic Books. And then Jonathan and I are talking about writing another graphic book, in this case, not just about Little Bighorn, but instead about the so-called Northern Cheyenne Exodus, which is the period between the end of Sand Creek, or you could include Sand Creek in that period, and we probably would, to the beginning of the reservation era. So that's in the 1880s and 90s for the Northern Cheyenne people, and it's a fascinating period in which the Northern Cheyenne tribe had to move and relocate as it was dispossessed repeatedly. There's a huge prison break from Fort Robinson and a number of other episodes. And so Jonathan and I have talked about doing that, but I don't know if we will or we won't. The COVID pandemic has put that one on hold. In terms of where people can find my books, I should say, I always encourage people to go to local bookshops and to ask them if they can order my stuff. Of course, you can always find it at places like Amazon and whatnot, but I'd rather that people support local shops if they possibly can. So in Denver or elsewhere, there are usually going to be some really good local bookshops, and I hope people would use those instead.
Definitely. And I look forward to your work. I value the research and the scholarship that you do. It's so important, and it's been helpful to me and my students too.
Thank you all for tuning in to the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. Thank you to Awareness for the music. I want to thank Dr. Ari Kelman for his time and generosity. Please support his work. Battle Lines is amazing, and if you are a graphic history fan, you got to check it out. And A Misplaced Massacre is a must-read. Please share the show, rate the show, and check out other podcasts on the Channel Zero Network.